Rosa appeared beside him, coat pulled tight against the chill. "They unveiled it this morning," she said. "Didn't want to make a spectacle," he smiled. "Good. Justice doesn't need spotlights. It needs witnesses." They stood in silence for a long time. Cars passed. The city breathed. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. Then Rosa said softly, "You changed everything." David shook his head. "No, I reminded everyone it was possible." She nodded. "That's enough." He looked once more at the plaque, at the reflection of the courthouse doors in the rainwater pooling near the curb, and whispered, "Case closed." The courthouse clock struck noon, but Judge Thompson didn't hear it. He was too busy signing letters, one after another, official appointments for his new mentorship program. It had been 8 months since that humiliating morning when handcuffs replaced respect. Now those same wrists carried the weight of transformation. Across the city, new training centers bore his framework, the human dignity model. Police academies from Chicago to Atlanta adopted it. Universities invited him to guest lecture on bias and belief in modern justice. But fame had never been his pursuit. For David, the reward was quieter. It was the sight of a young officer stopping a driver with calm respect. It was the sound of laughter instead of fear echoing through neighborhoods that once flinched at sirens. The world had started to shift, not because of his title, but because of his testimony. A gentle knock pulled him from his paperwork. "Come in," he said. The door opened, revealing Officer Harris. The same young man who'd once cuffed him outside the courthouse now stood dressed in a crisp uniform, his badge gleaming. He looked different, steadier, older somehow. "Your Honor," Harris began, awkward but sincere. "I wanted to thank you for not ending my career that day." David smiled faintly. "I didn't save your career, son." "You did, the moment you chose to learn." Harris hesitated, then stepped forward. "If it means anything, sir, I've been promoted to sergeant. The department made me the lead instructor for your program." "That means everything," David replied quietly. "Congratulations, Sergeant." But Harris wasn't finished. He pulled a small card from his pocket, worn, folded. "My dad wanted you to have this. He's retired law enforcement. Said you restored his faith in what this badge can mean." David unfolded the note. Inside, in careful handwriting, it read, "Real power isn't the right to act. It's the wisdom to pause." He folded it again slowly, the corners trembling in his hands. "Tell your father," he said. "He just summarized the Constitution." They both laughed, soft, real laughter, the kind that mends something invisible. 5 men. The man who once arrested him now protected his vision. That night, David sat at home in his quiet kitchen, light from the street lamp painting long shadows across the table. A photo of his daughter, Maya, rested beside his tea. She'd been silent for weeks after the arrest, embarrassed, angry, afraid for him. Then after the press conference, she texted only 3 words. "You handled it." Now, months later, his phone buzzed again. A video call request. He smiled and answered. Her face appeared, bright and proud. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, counselor," he teased. "How's law school treating you?" "Exhausting," she said, laughing. "But inspiring. Actually, I changed my thesis topic." "Oh? I'm writing about you." "Well, not you exactly. About judicial humility and restorative justice." David blinked, caught between surprise and emotion. "You always were dangerous with words." "Dad," Maya said softly, "that day, when I saw you in cuffs, I wanted to scream. But then I saw what you did after. You didn't destroy them. You educated them. That changed everything for me." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Then it was worth it. Promise me something?" she asked. "Anything. Don't stop teaching, even when they stop listening." David smiled gently. "That's the only part of my job I'll never retire from." 10 men in. The lesson that began in handcuffs now lived in classrooms. A month later, Judge Thompson stood on a stage at the National Judicial Conference. The room was filled with judges, attorneys, and policymakers, people who often decided fates from behind mahogany and glass. David adjusted the microphone, took a quiet breath, and began. When I was arrested outside this very courthouse last year, I learned something our textbooks don't teach, he said. Justice isn't a system. It's a mirror, and too often we're afraid to look into it. A ripple of silence spread across the hall. He continued. I wore these robes for 15 years believing they gave me authority. That day, stripped of them, I discovered they were only fabric. The real authority was empathy, the courage to understand before judging. He paused, scanning the audience. You cannot fix bias by punishing people who have it. You fix it by teaching them to see. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed. But David's eyes found only one face. Officer Harris, sitting quietly in the back, clapping harder than anyone. E-15 men. The courtroom that once humiliated him now honored him. By winter, the Thompson Protocol had reached Congress. A bipartisan bill proposed national funding for local dignity boards. Commentators called it the most human reform in decades. In Detroit, a black engineer wrongfully detained for trespassing now led diversity training for an entire precinct. In Texas, a Hispanic mother wrongly profiled on a traffic stop was hired by the city to design new community policies. And in dozens of towns, officers who'd once treated empathy as weakness now wore it as armor. News anchors described it as the ripple of a single arrest. But David never watched the broadcasts. He preferred handwritten notes. One, from a woman in Ohio, said simply, My son came home safe because your story made an officer think twice. He kept that one pinned to his wall. On the anniversary of his arrest, David walked alone to the same intersection where it happened. The night air was cold, clear. Street lights glowed like sentinels. He stood still, remembering the sound of the cuffs, the disbelief, the humiliation. But then he remembered something else. The silence afterward, when he had the power to condemn and chose to educate instead. That decision had changed everything. As he turned to leave, he noticed two officers parked nearby, chatting casually. One of them spotted him, froze, then quickly stepped out. Your Honor? The officer said nervously. We were just, David smiled gently. Relax, I'm just walking. The young officer nodded. Sir, we studied your case at the academy. They told us what you taught the department. Oh? Yes, sir. They told us. Every stop is a conversation, not a confrontation. David's chest tightened, not from pride, but from relief. It worked. Good, he said. Then carry it forward. Yes, sir. The officer smiled. We will. David walked away, the city lights shimmering off the wet pavement like 1,000 second chances. Jimin. He no longer carried anger, only evidence that grace changes systems. Months later, during a televised interview, the reporter leaned forward. Judge Thompson, if you could say one thing to America right now, what would it be? David looked straight into the camera, his voice steady and calm. I'd say this. Somewhere tonight, an officer's about to make a decision that could change 2 lives. Somewhere else, a young man's about to be judged for how he looks, not who he is. I want both of them to remember. Justice begins where assumption ends. He paused, letting the silence breathe. Look twice. Speak once. Listen always. That's how you rebuild trust, one pause at a time. The clip went viral overnight. Millions shared it. Thousands commented, confessing their own biases, promising to see differently. The next morning, Rosa entered his office with tears in her eyes. It's happening again, she said. They're calling it the second chance movement. David leaned back, smiling faintly. Then maybe we're finally getting it right. Years later, long after retirement, a bronze statue stood outside the courthouse. It didn't depict David in robes or behind a bench. Instead, it showed him standing calmly, hands open, not judging, listening. At the base, the inscription read, Justice is not what we declare. It's what we demonstrate. Judge David Thompson. Every morning, school children on field trips stopped to read the plaque. Some pointed, some asked questions. Teachers told the story of the judge who'd been arrested outside his own courtroom and chose forgiveness instead of fury. And every evening, officers walking their beat would pause there, straightening their uniforms just a little, a silent nod to the man who'd reminded them what those uniforms were supposed to mean. David smiled faintly. There always is, until the next election cycle turns morality into applause. Soft laughter rippled across the room. Relief. Not mockery, he continued. Gentlemen, this hearing will conclude with acknowledgement, not condemnation. I'll require a written statement from both of you detailing what you've learned and how you plan to apply it. Cole nodded firmly. You'll have it by morning, Your Honor. Good, David said. Then we'll consider this session adjourned. He struck the gavel once, a sound both soft and seismic. As the crowd began to stand, the mayor approached him privately. You could have pressed charges, David. Turned this into a national headline. David gathered his notes. I don't need headlines. I need change. The mayor studied him, humbled. You know, you just made every camera in this city your ally. David looked toward the packed hallway beyond the courtroom doors, where reporters waited like vultures disguised as professionals. Then let's give them a headline worth reading. He stepped out into the corridor. Flashes erupted instantly. Microphones surged forward, voices overlapping, questions fired like bullets. Judge Thompson, how do you feel after this morning's incident? Will there be disciplinary action? Are you pressing charges against the department? He raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady them. Ladies and gentlemen, I have no anger to share today. What happened this morning wasn't just about me. It was about us. About the assumptions we carry and the vision we refuse to sharpen. We can do better. We will do better. The world expected outrage. What they got instead was grace, and it shook them to their core. By evening, the footage had gone viral. Clips of the judge calmly addressing the officers aired on every major network. Talk shows debated his restraint. Editorial columns called it a masterclass in moral authority. But to David, the real work began only after the cameras turned away. That night, long after the courthouse emptied, he sat in his office, lights dim, robe folded neatly beside him. Rain tapped the window again, just like that morning, but softer now, almost rhythmic. Rosa entered quietly, holding 2 envelopes. These were dropped off for you, she said. One bore the city's seal. The other was unmarked. He opened the first. A formal letter from the chief of police. On behalf of the department, we extend our sincerest apologies for the events of this morning. Your professionalism turned a crisis into a mirror we needed to face. He smiled faintly, then opened the second. It was handwritten, the paper rough and cheap. Your Honor, I was one of the officers at the protest 2 years ago when you stood between us and the crowd. I didn't understand you then. Today I do. You didn't just protect justice, you protected its soul. No signature, just a badge number. He set it down, leaning back in his chair, eyes glistening. The courthouse clock struck midnight. Somewhere far below, the janitor's mop bucket rolled softly across the tiles, a reminder of the quiet work that never stops. David whispered to himself, Tomorrow, we start again. Morning sunlight crept through the courthouse windows, warm and deliberate, like forgiveness taking physical form. The city outside felt different, slower, quieter, almost careful. Overnight, Judge David Thompson's hearing had spread everywhere. Morning news, podcasts, community pages, but inside his chambers, there was no celebration, only work. He stood at his desk reviewing letters, dozens of them, sent by citizens, officers, students. Some thanked him. Others confessed shame. A few offered their own stories of mistaken identity, humiliation, and silence. Every page felt heavier than paper. Each line carried a piece of the same wound. Rosa entered balancing coffee and a folder thick with printouts. You made the front page of 5 outlets, she said softly. And the mayor wants to schedule a press conference this afternoon. David didn't look up. Tell him I'll attend, but not to talk about me. We're talking about policy. She smiled faintly. You always were allergic to attention. I prefer outcomes. Outside, reporters gathered at the courthouse steps. Every camera pointed at the same doorway where, just 24 hours earlier, he'd been handcuffed. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. Justice, it seemed, had a sense of theater. At noon, he walked down those same steps. No escort, no entourage. Just the steady rhythm of his shoes against the marble, micro cliffhanger, number 1, 5 men. The same man they'd arrested yesterday now approached the microphones that could rewrite their department's history. The mayor began first, rehearsed and cautious. Yesterday's incident revealed critical weaknesses in our procedures. Judge Thompson's leadership turned what could have been a tragedy into a turning point. Effective immediately, we're launching a full review of courthouse security protocols. Cameras clicked. David waited until the noise settled, then stepped forward. "This city doesn't need another review," he said evenly. "It needs reflection." He scanned the crowd, faces half hidden behind lenses, half hungry for scandal. "You've all seen the video. You've seen the cuffs, the confusion, the apology. But here's what you didn't see. What happens afterward, when embarrassment fades and patterns remain." He lifted a single sheet of paper. "These are 12 cases from the last year involving misidentification and unnecessary force. 12 reminders that the issue isn't one event. It's a culture of assumption." A hush spread. Even the mayor's polished confidence faltered. David continued, calm but resolute. "Today, I'm establishing a citywide task force under the court's authority, the Human Dignity Review Board. Its purpose is simple, to ensure no citizen, officer or public servant is judged by presumption before evidence." Applause erupted, not orchestrated, but genuine. Number 2, 10 Eminil. The press expected contrition. What they got was construction, a blueprint for accountability. That afternoon, phone calls flooded City Hall. Other districts wanted copies of the proposal. Universities invited him to speak. Civil rights groups offered support. Yet behind every headline, David saw something deeper stirring, a fragile willingness to change. 3 days later, he met with the police commissioner, an older man hardened by bureaucracy. The commissioner arrived defensive, folder in hand. "Your Honor, we're already overextended. Mandating new training could cripple our budget." David gestured to the empty courtroom. "You're sitting in the same room where an arrest almost destroyed public trust. What's the cost of that?" The man hesitated. David opened a drawer and placed 2 photos on the table. One from the arrest, one from the press conference. These images traveled the world. In one, fear ruled. In the other, respect returned. "Which do you want representing your department?" Silence stretched. Then the commissioner exhaled slowly. "We'll cooperate." David nodded. "Then we begin tomorrow." 3. 15 tougher men. For the first time in years, reform didn't start with anger. It started with agreement. Over the next month, the courthouse became an unlikely classroom. Officers attended workshops led by social psychologists, community leaders, even victims of profiling. David sat through every session, not as a judge, but as a participant. When one young officer nervously admitted, "I never realized how many assumptions I make before I even ask a question," David simply said, "Recognition is courage." Rosa documented every session, every transformation. By the 3rd week, morale inside the department began to shift, but reform, like truth, always meets resistance. One evening, local news aired an anonymous interview from an officer claiming the new program humiliated law enforcement. Critics demanded David step down, accusing him of overreach. The following morning, the courthouse steps once again filled with cameras. A reporter shouted, "Judge Thompson, how do you respond to claims that you're turning officers into suspects?" He paused, gaze steady. "Reform isn't humiliation, it's humility. When the system listens to its mistakes, it earns back its honor." The clip went viral again, doubling public support. Even his detractors had to admit his composure was disarming. 4 Amin. Every attack only made his message stronger. By midsummer, the board had processed its first dozen cases. Officers exonerated where misunderstanding was proven, reprimanded where abuse occurred. Transparency replaced secrecy. One afternoon, David received a letter from a mother. "My son was stopped last month." The officer apologized before he even asked for ID. Said he'd just finished your program. "My boy came home proud, not angry." "Thank you." David kept that letter on his desk. It reminded him why he'd chosen mercy over rage. Meanwhile, Officer Harris, once the nervous rookie, requested reassignment to the liaison program full-time. Sergeant Cole followed, volunteering to lead new training recruits. On graduation day for the first class of trainees, David stood before a room of fresh uniforms and spoke simply, "Your badge gives you authority. Your conduct gives it meaning. Remember which one the public sees first." They stood and applauded, not because they had to, but because they understood. 525 Miney. The same courthouse that once echoed with conflict now echoed with commitment. Autumn has arrived. The initiative expanded statewide. National outlets called it the Thompson Model. But the moment that mattered most came quietly, without press or audience. Late one evening, David left the courthouse and walked past the spot where his arrest had occurred. The pavement was clean now, rain-polished. A new plaque had been installed there, small but dignified. On this ground, justice listened and learned. He stopped, staring at it under the streetlight. He walked behind his desk but didn't sit. Instead, he opened the briefcase, removed a single folder marked Community Trust Program Proposal, a pilot initiative he'd drafted months ago, ignored by the city council. He placed it on the table. "I was going to present this next week, but now you've given me the perfect opening argument." The mayor frowned. "Argument?" David met his gaze. "This morning wasn't an arrest, it was a demonstration." Everyone looked confused. He continued, voice calm but charged. "For years we've discussed accountability in meetings, in panels, in polite emails. Today we saw it fail in real time, and we recorded it. Now we decide what to do with that evidence." The sergeant shifted in his seat. "Sir, if I could explain—" "You will," David said. "Under oath if necessary." The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples. "Judge Thompson, the media's already running the story. We'll issue a statement, call it a misunderstanding." David's voice cut through the room. "No, call it what it was, a moment of blindness. Because we can't fix what we won't name." He'd been humiliated in public, but he was about to turn that humiliation into law. Rosa stepped forward with a folder of printouts. "Sir, these are copies of the footage circulating online. Hundreds of thousands of views already." David nodded. "Then the world is watching. Good. Let them see what accountability looks like when handled with composure." The mayor looked uncertain. "You're sure you want to proceed with the morning docket? After all this?" David smiled faintly. "The docket is exactly where this belongs." He turned toward the two officers, voice measured. "Gentlemen, you'll remain here until you're called. You'll testify not in defense, but in reflection." Then he lifted the robe from the back of his chair. The fabric, still damp at the hem, carried both the weight of duty and the sting of insult. He held it a moment longer than usual before sliding it over his shoulders. The room went silent. Even the mayor stopped breathing for a beat. The transformation was simple yet seismic, handcuffed man to presiding judge, and as he adjusted the collar, he spoke the words that would echo across the state by nightfall. "Court is now in session." The same cuffs that bound him that morning would bind the truth by evening. He moved toward the double doors leading into the courtroom. Rosa opened them slowly, revealing a packed gallery. Word had spread. Staff from every floor filled the benches. The smell of damp coats and paper filled the air. David stepped behind the bench, laid his gavel on the wood, and looked out over faces that reflected shock, guilt, curiosity, and admiration. "Good morning," he began, voice steady as stone. "Today's session will not follow the usual schedule. Instead, we'll begin with a case that unfolded just outside these walls." He paused, letting the tension breathe. The people versus assumption. A murmur rippled through the room. "This morning," he continued, 3 officers detained a man without cause. They believed they were enforcing order. In truth, they revealed disorder, the quiet kind that hides behind procedure. He gestured toward the back where the officers sat, pale and silent. "We'll hear testimony not to punish, but to understand. Because justice isn't revenge, it's recognition." The mayor shifted uncomfortably, but the audience was spellbound. For years, this courthouse has demanded truth from everyone who steps inside it. Today it demands truth from itself. He struck the gavel once. The sound was deep, resonant, final. And with that, the arrest that began in chaos transformed into the first hearing of a new kind of justice, one born not from power, but from restraint. Outside, the storm cleared. Sunlight broke through clouds, glinting off wet pavement like a benediction. David glanced at his reflection in the polished bench. A man, still damp from rain, still bearing faint red marks on his wrists, but unbroken. His eyes lifted toward the gallery where Rosa stood among clerks and citizens, tears streaking her cheeks. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. He had walked into the courthouse as a suspect. He would walk out of it as a symbol. And this was only the beginning. The air inside the courtroom felt different now. No one whispered. No one scrolled their phones. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to quiet itself, as though the entire building understood the gravity of what was happening. Judge David Thompson sat high on the bench, robe draped over his shoulders like armor forged from patience. Beneath him, the two officers, Sergeant Cole and Officer Harris, sat rigidly at the defense table, their uniforms still damp from rain. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Just hours ago, they'd stood as accusers. Now they faced the full gaze of the court they once believed they served without question. David folded his hands. This hearing is informal but essential. What occurred this morning wasn't a crime of violence, yet it wounded something deeper. Trust. He paused, letting the word hang there. Without trust, law is just paper. So today we will rebuild it, word by word. Across the room, Rosa sat near the front row, notepad ready, eyes fierce with pride and worry. Behind her, the mayor and internal affairs investigators listened in silence, cameras discreetly positioned along the walls. The footage was already being streamed live to the city's Justice Department, an unprecedented move, approved by David himself. Officer Harris, David said, his tone calm but unwavering. You first. Walk this court through your decision to detain me. The young officer swallowed. Sir, the call came about a suspicious vehicle parked near the restricted zone. You exited the car quickly, carrying a case. You didn't respond immediately when we called out. And what did you assume I was doing? David asked. Harris hesitated. Sir, I assumed you might be armed, or attempting to access the building illegally. Did it cross your mind that I could be an employee? David asked gently. No, sir. Why not? Harris looked down. Because it didn't fit what I expected. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The honesty was painful and real. David nodded. That's the first truth we've heard today. Expectations. They shape our perception more than facts. He turned to Sergeant Cole, the senior officer. And you, Sergeant? You oversaw this arrest. Did your years of experience suggest caution? Yes, Your Honor, Cole said quietly. But I also believed I was protecting the court. We've had threats recently. David leaned forward slightly. So protection justified assumption? No, sir, Cole said after a long silence. It doesn't. David nodded again. Thank you. Recognition is the first step toward accountability. He wasn't there to destroy reputations. He was rebuilding something far more valuable. The room exhaled collectively. Then David stood descending from the bench. The gavel stayed behind. He wanted no barrier, no height, no symbol of power between himself and the men before him. He walked slowly to the table, his presence commanding but calm. Gentlemen, when you cuffed me, I didn't feel anger. I felt history repeating itself. Do you understand what I mean? The sergeant nodded faintly. I do now, sir. David looked toward the gallery. History has long confused authority with wisdom. But real authority doesn't shout. It listens. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed sheet. This is a report from my Community Trust Initiative. It details 15 similar incidents involving public servants misidentified as suspects within this very district. Postal workers, nurses, even teachers. Every one of them left the same way. Humiliated. Unseen. He placed the report on the evidence table. We talk about reform, but we never finish the conversation because the shame is too heavy. Shame makes people defensive. But truth makes people better. The courtroom stayed utterly still. Then Rosa rose unexpectedly. "Your Honor, may I speak?" He nodded. She stepped forward, voice trembling but clear. "This morning I saw something I'll never forget. Not the arrest, but how you handled it. You didn't raise your voice once. You didn't fight back. You taught." She turned toward the officers. "That's leadership. You could have ruined them. Instead, you're showing the whole city what it looks like when dignity meets discipline." Applause rippled faintly through the benches. David raised a hand, soft, not scolding. "Thank you, Rosa, but let's not crown the lesson before we finish it." He turned back to the officers. "You made a mistake. The question now is, what will you do with it?" Officer Harris spoke first. "Sir, I'd like to volunteer for community engagement detail, maybe work with outreach programs that train officers on bias." Cole nodded beside him. "And I'll take responsibility for our team. We need training, not just on tactics, but on perception. We can't defend what we don't understand." David studied their faces. They were sincere, shaken, changed. He returned to the bench and sat. "Very well. You've both earned something rare in this room, an opportunity for redemption." Justice wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about evolution. He motioned for Rosa to bring him a document. "I'm issuing an immediate order establishing the Integrity Liaison Program. Effective today, every officer assigned to courthouse security will undergo cultural competence certification and direct community service under court supervision." The mayor leaned forward. "Judge Thompson, are you formalizing this policy?" David's eyes held steady. "Yes, and I expect your office to fund it." The mayor hesitated. "There'll be political pushback." The night air burned blue with flashing lights. Laughter, sharp, mocking, echoed off courthouse walls as two officers slammed a man against his own car. His briefcase burst open, papers scattering across wet concrete like fallen feathers. "Got another one pretending to be important," one of them sneered. The man didn't fight, didn't raise his voice. His eyes just lifted, past the cuffs, past the cameras, to the tall stone building ahead. The courthouse. His courthouse. "Sir!" a trembling clerk shouted, racing down the steps. "You don't understand who he is!" But they didn't listen. They never do. And by the time they realized their mistake, the man they mocked would be standing above them, wearing robes of judgment. The courthouse parking lot shimmered beneath a hard November sky, half rain, half light, the kind of morning when breath turns visible, when everything feels 1 degree away from breaking. David Thompson adjusted the knot of his tie as he stepped from his car. The same routine every day: arrive before sunrise, review the docket, greet the bailiffs, hold the gavel steady while the rest of the city still searches for coffee. He loved that quiet hour before the noise of justice began, when the world still felt fair. But this morning, fairness didn't follow him. A new security checkpoint had been installed the night before. 2 local officers, unfamiliar with courthouse staff, stood watch. They were tired, cold, and already angry at a world they didn't understand. When David reached for his briefcase, they caught only the motion, not the man. "Sir, hands where we can see them." He turned, calm. "Good morning, officers. I work here." The command came sharper. "Hands, now!" In the half-second between instruction and action, something irreversible happened. Assumption. It snapped across the space like static. One officer's hand moved to his holster, the other radioed for backup. David froze, not in fear, but disbelief. He'd been mistaken for many things in life, but never for a threat on the very steps of justice itself. The first cruiser arrived within a minute, lights slicing through the gray drizzle. By the time the third arrived, a small crowd had gathered. Law clerks, delivery drivers, a janitor clutching a broom mid-stride, phone cameras tilted upward, blinking red dots recording everything. David spoke slowly, evenly, the way he'd coached dozens of nervous witnesses to speak in court. "Gentlemen, my identification is in the inner pocket of my coat. My name is—" "Save it," one of them cut in. "We'll sort that out downtown." They spun him toward his car, pressed him forward, metal biting his wrists. The chill of steel shocked him more than the humiliation. His briefcase slipped from his grasp, crashing open on the asphalt. Legal documents, motions, depositions, and rulings spilled like confetti of another man's dignity. He could hear them laughing behind him. Not cruel laughter, worse, casual, routine, the kind people use when they believe they're right. The courthouse clock struck 8. Inside those marble walls, an entire docket waited on him. Defendants, attorneys, victims, all dependent on the man now pressed against a hood. He looked up toward the building, to the high windows of his courtroom. The flag atop the dome snapped in the wind. He whispered a single sentence to himself. "Stay calm, David. You taught others how to stand tall. Now live it." A young clerk, named Rosa Perez, burst from the entrance, heels clicking frantically. She recognized him instantly. "Stop! Stop! What are you doing? He works here." Her words dissolved in the wind. The sergeant waved her off. "Ma'am, please step back. Court employees are inside only after screening. We've got a procedure." "Procedure?" she cried. "That's the Han." Her voice cracked before she finished. One of the officers stepped between them, blocking her view. David caught Rosa's eyes, wide, pleading, and shook his head subtly. "Don't. Let it play." There was power in patience. He wasn't fighting the arrest because he was already building the case. The officers searched his vehicle, finding nothing but a gavel pouch, a robe garment bag, and a folder marked Judicial Ethics Committee. None of it mattered. The narrative had already written itself. Man in nice car, acting confident, must be lying. One officer smirked. "You must really like courtrooms, buddy. You'll see plenty of one soon." David answered softly, "I already do." They didn't hear him. Or maybe they didn't want to. Rain began again, light but relentless, darkening his tailored suit. Each drop felt like punctuation in a story he hadn't consented to. He'd spent decades teaching young lawyers that justice begins long before a verdict. It begins in how we look at each other. Now, standing cuffed beside his own vehicle, he wondered if the system he'd dedicated his life to could still recognize him as human. Across the street, an elderly man, Mr. Wells, the courthouse custodian, watched from the steps. He'd seen everything. He'd mopped floors during the hardest trials, comforted victims who'd fainted, and saluted every morning when David arrived. Now he watched that same man reduced to a headline in real time. Mr. Wells whispered under his breath, "Lord, give them eyes to see." The sergeant finally called it in. "Suspect detained outside south entrance. Claims he's part of staff," Static replied. Then the dispatcher's voice crackled through. "Copy, name." The sergeant glanced at the wallet another officer had just pulled from David's coat. He flipped open the ID and froze. The laminated card bore the state seal, embossed in gold. Honber David A. Thompson, Chief Judge, District Court. Silence radiated outward like shock waves. Sergeant?" The younger officer swallowed. "You might want to read that again." The older man's face went pale. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of the flag overhead. David met their eyes, voice calm. "You have my identification. Would you please remove these cuffs?" the sergeant stammered. "Sir, Judge Thompson, I didn't—" "I know," David interrupted gently. "You didn't know." He turned his wrists, waiting. The keys rattled, awkward, metallic. When the cuffs finally released, he flexed his hands, blood returning like forgiveness. But he didn't leave. He gathered the wet papers one by one, placing them back in his briefcase with deliberate care. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, phones still recording. One voice from the onlookers said, "That's the judge. He's the one who swore in the mayor last year." Every officer froze again. David stood tall, water dripping from his sleeves, and looked each of them in the eye. "Gentlemen," he said softly, Follow me. He walked toward the courthouse steps, the same path he'd walked for 15 years, but this time with an audience of silence behind him. Each footstep echoed against the marble facade, a drumbeat of accountability. At the top, he paused, turned, and faced them. "You'll accompany me inside. I'd like your reports firsthand." The rookie spoke first, his voice trembling. "Sir, are we under arrest?" David almost smiled. Not yet. They'd cuffed the wrong man, but the right lesson was just beginning. Inside, the building smelled of polish and paper, the perfume of law. Clerks whispered, bailiffs stared. Word spread floor to floor faster than any official memo. The chief judge had been arrested outside his own courthouse. David moved steadily down the corridor, wet shoes squeaking on tile. Every step felt heavier than the last, not from shame, but from purpose. In his chambers, he set the briefcase down, wiped water from the leather, and exhaled slowly. Rosa entered behind him, breathless. "Sir, Internal Affairs is on the way. The mayor, too." "Good," he said. "Let them come." "Should I cancel court for the morning?" "No." He straightened the soaked robe that still hung in its garment bag. "We're going to hold court, Rosa. Just not the kind they expect." She hesitated at the doorway. "Sir, are you okay?" He looked at his reflection in the window, tie crooked, cuff marks faintly red around his wrists. "I'm more than okay," he said quietly. "I've waited my whole life for the chance to prove what justice really means." Outside, sirens faded. Inside, tension grew. The officers sat in the waiting area, drenched, speechless. The rookie wiped his hands over and over with a napkin as if scrubbing away the morning. The sergeant stared at the floor. David entered, robe now draped over his arm, not yet worn. "We'll wait for your supervisors," he said evenly. "Until then, you'll stay here as guests. No phones, please." They nodded, ashamed. The same hands that had cuffed him now rested motionless on their knees. Rosa returned with a towel and a cup of coffee. "They're saying the press is outside," she whispered. "Let them wait. The truth deserves an audience." He sipped the coffee, its warmth steadying him. Through the glass door, he could see a crowd forming, lawyers, city staff, even jurors scheduled for that day. All whispering, all watching. He stepped closer to the officers. "Tell me," he asked quietly, "what made you certain I was guilty?" The rookie hesitated. "Sir, it's protocol to verify credentials." "No, I'm asking what made you certain." The silence stretched long enough for truth to emerge. "You looked out of place," the rookie admitted finally. "Nice car, expensive suit. We just didn't expect someone like you here this early." David nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer. Hold on to that honesty. You'll need it soon." A knock sounded at the chamber door. The mayor entered, flanked by Internal Affairs investigators. "Judge Thompson," he began, voice heavy, "I can't tell you how sorry we are." David gestured toward the seats. "Don't apologize to me. Sit, listen, learn."